G'day everybody and welcome to Connected. It's awesome to be connected with you. If we're not already following one another on Twitter, you can see my handle down below or join the community of practice that I lead, Cell in Education, focused on social and emotional learning. It's a great program that Connected has lined up, wrapped around topics like mindfulness, emotional intelligence, inclusive classroom practices and well-being. All supercharged by, inspiring stories from educators and leaders from around the globe. So a great program to be a part of. I'm Mark Sparvel. I'm an education leader, in Microsoft, coming to you from Kirkland in Washington State, USA. And you've probably noticed a little bit of an accent. Indeed, it's Australian. I've drawn a beautiful map of Australia over Canada, so you can see roughly the size of Australia. I think Canada has about 39 million people. Australia has, I think, about 26 million. Our land mass is about the same size as USA, which has, a whopping 320 something million people. In Australia, there's about one kangaroo for every person. Speaking of which, my little plug for the Australian Tourism Commission, it's full of dangerous creatures which will kill you, most of which you can't see. That's why you can't see all of the spiders in the slide. There's just too many to show. Snakes, white pointers, drop bears, that large black bird whose name escapes me momentarily, but I'm sure somebody will tweet it out to me, crocodiles, and of course, Russell Crowe, though technically not an Australian. So what I'm going to do is talk about the now, the near and the next. And I will touch on this sort of notion of new future ready skills, but we need to situate that really within this current context and this idea around education sort of reimagined. So consider this session to be both an introduction and also an invitation. It's an introduction to some new research. And we know that when we take from one person, it's stealing, but when we take from many people, it's research. So it's an introduction to research and an invitation to follow up anything that you hear with myself using either Twitter or track me down through any other the social means. First and foremost, I'm a teacher of 25 years plus, and I was pondering my favourite teaching moments, and the curious thing was they were all, in a sense, remote learning. And the lessons that I learned from those have carried me throughout my career, indeed, right to this moment. And it's a great thing maybe for you to do sometime. Think about your top 3 teaching moments. What were they and what made it so special? In the top left-hand corner, I'm in remote Northern Australia at a little school called Mataranka, and I'm conducting a webinar. Here comes the garbage truck, apologies for the noise. I'm conducting a webinar. The students are teaching other students around Australia about the march of the toxic cane toad across Northern Australia. It's a carnivorous, gigantic, ugly toad with poisonous pustules on its back, and the kids are teaching other kids about it. And what this taught me was that students are experts with stories to tell, and students should be teaching other students. Directly below that, the big question was, is it better to not see a dolphin in the wild than it is to be guaranteed to see a dolphin in a marine park? What we had that you can't see, trawling behind this little boat, is a hydrophone. It's a microphone underwater, listening for the chatter of conversation between the bottlenose dolphins of the Port River as they're moving along the backstairs passage, a piece of water between Kangaroo Island and Yankalilla in South Australia. Connected in this remote learning webinar were marine experts and students. So the students, of course, wanted to know about, do whales and dolphins have external genitals? How do they go to the toilet? All sorts of interesting questions. Yeah, you can message me afterwards if you need the answer to that. In the top right-hand corner, Surf's Up. Had the great privilege of being a leader in a school which was focused on environmental sustainability, and also marine learning and aquatics programs. So myself, like many students, learned to surf through that school. It was a school that taught surfing. And what this taught me was that some things are best experienced in real life, but when we have the right balance between pressure and support, it moves us to that zone where we're prepared to take a leap of faith around our own capacity and our own ability, not just to make do, not just to survive, but to flourish and thrive. So this taught me a lot about the importance of efficacy, this belief that we can make a difference, we can do more and be more. You know, what this pandemic has shown us is how connected we are globally. In fact, the theme of this conversation right here and now. Things spread fast and they spread at scale. Misinformation, fear, a virus. You know, challenges when we're connected become shared challenges. And the great thing really here, the thing that we're fortunate about is that as the challenges become shared challenges, the solutions when we're connected become shared solutions. And as a profession, you know, it's just simply better together when we're connected. So what's happened? We know since mid-April, 191 countries, have been impacted by the physical closure of schools. Somewhere between 1.6 and 1.7 billion students, if you like, that 72% of the world's students had moved into some form of remote learning delivery. And we recognise that there's a huge disparity both between countries and within countries. Some data coming up about that in a moment. There are some groups that have been impacted more than others. Refugees, migrant labourers, those with poor access to healthcare, sanitisation, those who, are from families who can simply not afford not to work. There's a massive risk globally for at-risk youth just simply not returning to school. And when you think about the fact that children make up over half of the world's 22.5 million refugees, you recognise that, this is both a humanitarian crisis as well as a public health crisis and an economic crisis. And education is kind of right at the intersection of all of those. There's this tension that we recognise too, that's between this possibility that this event on one hand might provide a forcing function for much needed education reform. On the other hand, it may significantly widen existing equity gaps for those groups who are most vulnerable. So if we have a look at some of those variances, this is from the OECD PISA studies across the 48 countries in the OECD. For many students, the reality is they don't have a quiet place to study, full stop. You can see from the left-hand side of the screen to the right, those who have access to a quiet place of study. In the centre is the OECD average, and over to the right, those who more than likely don't have a quiet place. If you notice the gap between the diamond and the triangle, this is indicating the difference between advantaged and disadvantaged schools. If we look at, do I have a computer available for schoolwork? You'll see there's a vast difference if you happen to be an advantaged school student in Denmark compared to a disadvantaged school student in Indonesia, for example. OECD average in the centre, organised in descending order. Principals were asked about this efficacy, this sense of competence and capacity that teachers have both with technology and the ability to incorporate the right pedagogies to use the technology to drive quality learning in their institutions. So this shows that global variance along here from, Qatar in its advantage and disadvantaged schools, all the way through to, some curious ones down on the right-hand side of the OECD average. What we see in this graph is some really interesting kind of disparities between advantaged and disadvantaged schools in the collective teacher efficacy, which, as we know from John Hattie's meta-analysis, collective teacher efficacy, the belief that groups of teachers have that they can make a difference, has a significant impact on student learning outcomes. So continuing that theme, if you like, around disparities and changes, One of the things that McKinsey and Company recently released was, was this continuum of approaches and timelines to reopen. And we know that this is varying massively across the globe. A friend of mine, Mark Modra, teacher in Queensland, Australia, they had 5 weeks remote learning and they've been back to physical school for the last 5 weeks. It was a very quick experience. Another principal friend of mine, school is sort of physically opened, but only for the 5-year-olds through to the 8-year-olds. The rest of the school is currently still working remotely, and then there are plans to bring them back in a more hybrid model where they're sharing. Others are having days on, days off. Others are having staggered time schedules for different age groups with opportunities to clean in between. So, what does this look like? In places even like Wuhan, on May the 6th, students are physically returned to physical schools, but students are studying behind plastic partitions. In Taiwan, April 29th, students eat their lunch separated behind shields. In Edinburgh, the children of frontline workers, essential workers, have returned to physical schools, but find themselves sitting and eating lunch alone. In Paris, a young child adjusts her mask, has her temperature checked at the door, applies hand sanitizer, and starts her first day at kindergarten. In Venezuela, parents line up with notepads and pens and copy down the work for the week for their students in low connectivity or emerging connectivity scenarios. So this is not a new normal, if anything. This is education being reimagined and recreated on the fly. In fact, the only place I think you'll find normal is on your washing machine as one of the cycles. This is certainly, a return to abnormal for many people, and a sliding scale of that. So we were curious about, what might the future of learning look like? And, how might we strategically draw upon successful practices across the globe, both in traditional classrooms and remote learning scenarios, and cast those forwards to provide some insights and some guidance as schools start to consider what Education Reimagined might look like. So we partnered with New Pedagogies for Deep Learning and published just about a week ago the paper you can see on your screen there, Education Reimagined, the Future of Learning. And we're going to dig into that in this session. So we thought about, how do we create more adaptive, more flexible models of school, which have a focus around equity, health and safety, well-being, and quality learning. And that's what we're going to be digging into. In the centre is the class of 2030. So this new research builds upon insights published in the class of 2030 and the new paper, Staff of 2030. The links are there for you to download those. Here's some interesting things from the class of 2030 published 2 years ago. We asked thousands and thousands of students across 5 or 6 countries about learning and skills. They identified social and emotional skills as being fundamental and not ornamental for their learning. Relationship skills, self-regulation, they saw as being essential for their success. The students said clearly that they didn't want their learning to be automated, but they did want autonomy. However, they didn't want this autonomy just to be provided. They wanted to have teachers who knew their learners and how they learn, knew their curriculum and how to teach, to provide guided release of skills so the students could get to a point where they were in control of their learning. In fact, the students believed that they would learn up to 70% more effectively with greater control over the pace and the modality of the learning. It's all available in the class of 2030. The role of the teacher in this was amplified. The students themselves wanted to use technology to create and be creative and to solve problems which were meaningful and purposeful. Earlier this year, we published the Staff of 2030 because we were curious about what pre-service and early career teachers thought about the profession that they were about to enter. What were their aspirations? What were their expectations? And then what were their experiences around being a teacher in this current sort of context. A couple of interesting things came up. One was around generational shifts within the profession. We know that Generation Y and Z currently represent 70% of the workforce globally, the two youngest generations. We know that in our schools, we're currently seeing and will likely see more, up to 5 generations coexisting, co-working and co-learning. We know that Generation Z are in this curious spot where they're both still in our classrooms, they're also in our universities studying to become teachers, and they're also entering our staff rooms as early career teachers, which is kind of like an interesting mix. That generation really want to engage in work that has purpose and meaning. Whether they're the students or whether they're the early career teachers, they want to engage in work that's purposeful and meaningful. It simply just has to matter to them. Let's dig into Education Reimagined. Education Reimagined positions a sort of a 3-phase model that schools and systems are finding themselves moving between at the moment. A disruption phase, first of all, this rapid reaction and response. So we've kind of navigated through that. We move to delivering learning remotely in some form. Then it enters a transitional phase where, remote learning has sort of been embedded. It's digging down a bit deeper, but there's plans being put in place for a return to some sort of physical service delivery, education delivery. And then importantly, there's the opportunistic reimagining phase where new models can be explored, where the best of online and offline traditional classroom, the best of what we've learned from the remote learning experience can be cast forwards into, if you like, a new hybrid. In that first stage, the disrupted stage, it's important to note that even within there's movement. If we're just locked into react and respond, this could be problematic over time for our learners. So the paper positions a shift from the unsettled uncertainty into the learning zone and then moving towards growth, even within that disrupted phase. Moving towards those key questions of who is learning, who is struggling at a system level, how do we ensure well-being, how do we provide quality learning in this current environment. In the transition phase, there are 4 key considerations. Number 1 comes through clearly no matter which study you look at. Be mindful of well-being. Number 2, must use this opportunity to strategically reflect on the lessons learned with an appreciative lens. Number 3, manage safety and operations. Number 4, let's lead the learning agenda. So let's dig into those in a little bit of time. Well-being is the number 1 job for leaders and teachers. A focus on well-being and belonging for all is the number 1. This is because emotion is the gatekeeper for motivation, cognition, and attention. Nothing else will happen with great purpose and meaning unless people feel psychologically safe in their environments. And our return to school is operating at a backdrop of food security concerns, of grief, trauma, unemployment, homelessness, economic strain, forced mobility for many. So what matters here greatly is the mindset of the educators and the leaders, and also the skill set. Do you know enough about trauma-informed practices, for example? If you're interested in digging in a little bit deeper into the social and emotional side, I've put my top 10 tips to try Monday, not someday, on that short URL. And again, the community of practice I lead is also underneath that. Feel free to join and share that. Things being shared daily. Some really quick tips on the social and emotional side. There are much better experts than me presenting across ConnectEd, but starting each day with a mood check. This introduces an invitation to recognize that all emotions matter and have a purpose. Also an opportunity to develop emotional vocabulary. As Mark Brackett will say, you must name it, to tame it. And there's a link where you can get a template and you can build your own mood check-in, and you can deliver that at any time, staff or students. Another idea, and these guys are speaking in Connect Ed, Mario and Alberto, they use OneNote and they use an emotion wheel using digital inking, so the students can respond to how they feel today, but can also provide valuable information to the teachers around the need for maybe some social and emotional learning support or some emotional first aid. You know, I love using sort of emotion wheels which increase the granularity, the language used to describe emotions. You know, a quick tip for me is I download the emoticon keyboard into Word and into PowerPoint, and I might have the students replace emotion words with emoticons or replace emoticons with emotion words using the wheel. Of course, tools like Teams, if you're using that, have a praise feature built in to allow student to student, teacher to student praise, plus also has an emoticon library and a sticker and GIF library, so you can bring life, vibrancy, fun and joy into the learning experience, recognizing, you know, small or major events in students' lives like Stephen Eustace does. And of course, Minecraft Education Edition has a specific world, a medieval world called Mindful Night, which allows students to practice self-reflection and mindfulness activities within the Minecraft Education Edition experience. And clever teachers send home resources to parents. You know, this is an example of what to ask instead of how was your day. But if you act like an emotion detective and you highlight the emotion words, you'll see that what the teacher is cleverly doing is introducing and enhancing emotional vocabulary just through a class newsletter. The second step, the first step is about well-being. The second step is to take this intentionally appreciative lens to find out what has worked and what we need to take forwards. So, you know, this doesn't ignore that there are problems and challenges, but it seeks to place our conscious efforts into working out where our successes have been so we can build upon those successes and move forwards. So there are some key questions all organized through a lens of equity, well-being, and quality learning, focused on those three critical areas of safety, well-being, and learning, which leadership teams or even teachers can use to help guide some conversations to move forwards. How did technology help and hinder the well-being of students? Number 3, not too much time on this, but this is very operational but very critical. We've built out in the research a 5-page comprehensive operational checklist for schools to use to help them undertake, if you like, a stock take of readiness for reopening or considerations once they've reopened to ensure that student needs are met, that quality learning is in place, that health and safety is considered. The most critical one here is obviously around teaching quality, which and leading the learning agenda, which, you know, we need to keep placing at the forefront of what we do. The Education Endowment Fund conducted a recent survey around sort of remote learning experiences, and they came up with these sort of 5 very obvious but 5 kind of research-based insights which are useful to consider. Some other things to consider is we know that peer interaction provides motivation and improved learning outcomes. Are your students interacting enough? Do they know how? Independent learning improves learning outcomes. Choice, voice, and agency matter greatly to students for their participation and engagement, and technology is the key. The Education Endowment Fund also suggested some strategies to help, which seem to have been effective, like get into the habit of participating and practice participating in these kind of online or offline environments before there is a need to, because there's something critical. So reduce the cognitive load by rehearsing participation beforehand. Connect old ideas to new ideas. Use what psychologists call the spacing effect to chunk out and revisit content through active processing and retrieval. So, these are good old-fashioned, in a sense, pedagogical approaches that are very, very relevant for remote learning. So, retrieval practice is critical. Linking students back to previous content and bringing it forwards, building on it, is critical. Balancing synchronous and asynchronous experiences, really important. And we see this when we listen to teacher groups online. I'm on some Facebook groups and Twitter groups. The teacher on the left sounds funny, but also sounds like, in a sense, she's repeating her existing paradigm. She's, missed being a teacher, so I've stood in the lounge, let my coffee go cold, and didn't go to the toilet for 7 hours, and repeated to myself. Whereas President Pat has taken a more invitational approach. He's recognised a student isn't paying attention to their daily video catch-up because the student is busy cooking, probably for their family, so instead rebuilds an assignment for that student around creating, narrating, and scripting and storyboarding a cooking show instead of the English language assignment that had been posted. So learning had become invitational, not just instructional. And that can happen in remote learning environments powerfully. A teacher the other day, I was on a session of theirs, and they'd introduced students to the measurement of volume in a maths lesson of 3D spaces, and then had said, hey everybody, set your watch. You've got 30 minutes. I want you to go around your space safely, find 2 3-dimensional objects, boxes, cupboards, rooms, whatever it might be, compare their volume, and then report back in 30 minutes. I mean, that was invitational. Without intrigue, your lesson plan is just a lesson plan, but with intrigue, it becomes self-directed learning, which is what we want. Onto the skill bit. Emerging discoveries from the new paper, Education Reimagined, the Future of Learning. Some students have done well, okay? Many haven't, and we know that. But if we take this appreciative lens and we go, who are the students that did well? What were the skills and dispositions that they had, and do they matter for how we prepare learners in the future? And it seemed that these skill sets were pretty important. Critical thinking, creativity, self-regulation, independence, cognitive flexibility, and this ability to persist where there was purpose, keeping in mind that if there's no purpose and there's no passion, then grit is just an activity in compliance. But where there is purpose and passion and meaning to the work, perseverance is powerful and is owned by the learner. But here's what's interesting. McKinsey and Company recently, in the last 2 months, released some insights around the new future-ready skills for employers. They noted that, unlike in the past, where we tend to have thought around future-ready skills being technical skills for the digital economy, they've recognised that they involve an interesting mix between technology skills, social and emotional skills, and these higher-order cognitive skills. The new future-ready skills to be in demand now and into the future are a delicate interaction between those 3 pillars: technical, social and emotional, cognitive. But there are some missing skills also called out. Problem solving, critical thinking, innovation and creativity. The ability to deal with complexity, ambiguity, basically to learn under stress. And also communication. So these might sound familiar from what our paper found in the Education Reimagined. So here's a little map of them. You can see that where there's a green tick, there's a direct connection. Where there's an orange tick, it's kind of has to be in place. For example, if you're going to deal with complexity, you probably are able to self-regulate. If you're able to problem solve, there's a good chance that you're able to persevere. So there's this interesting match between what business and the world wants in terms of new future-ready skills and the skills that are coming to the top as being enablers for success for young people in this education disrupted, reimagined phase. So I'm wrapping up. You might know kintsukuroi, I think that's how you pronounce it, pottery. It's a technique used to restore broken pottery with usually gold solder. So the damage actually becomes the asset. The object becomes stronger. It becomes more beautiful because it's more unique as a result of the damage that it's experienced. For teachers, this isn't a return to normal. This is education reimagined. And, when we lead, we need to sort of lead with a sense of hope and a positive mindset, and also a beginner's mindset around the fact that, we might learn and we might fail. And that the only difference between, an expert and a novice is the expert has failed more times than the novice has tried. This was a quote that early in my teaching career really made a huge difference to me. And it was the recognition of the impact of the teacher in creating the climate, that the daily mood makes the weather, and the power that we have as educators and as school leaders to shape environments and to create preferred futures, not necessarily probable futures. If you're looking for some courseware to follow up with, alongside the staff of 2030 and Future Ready Teaching, we've released a course on the Microsoft Educator Center Leading Schools 2030 course, and I'd recommend that you dig into that. So in closing, a little bit of advice, and then I'm out. But feel free to follow up though on Twitter. I would say this: go easy on yourself. Whatever you've done this week, today, let it be enough. Practice that self-compassion, because, when we lead and when we teach, we lead and teach with ourselves, and we want that to be our best selves, because, our young people need our best self more now than they ever had. So thank you very much for being part of Connected. Really looking forward to the other sessions. Looking forward to catching up with some of you online, offline in the near future. Bye for now.